Lesson 2.10, Visions, Epics, and Stories. Today's learning objectives, we will discuss the implementation and utilization of visions, epics, and user stories. Isn't that rather interesting? It sounds like uh, visions, epics, and stories. It's sort of like a movie, making a movie, doesn't it? Okay, I've never seen this explained in any of the training that I've had, but relative to the succession, the hierarchy of these particular elements. Although I saw something online and I thought it was really important, it kind of made sense. When you start to work through developing the sprint goals and so forth, the items that you really need to have are these explicit items. Now you can also throw in, project iteration. You can throw in user stories, and then you could have like sub stories, subtasks of stories, what have you. But these are for the focused items that you really need to come in on and really get an understanding and really produce on these. So let's talk about these things. Okay, so vision. Vision describes who your product is for, what it does, and what you do differently than others. If you take a look, if you go online and check out Apple's description of their vision, it's rather high level, but it's rather impactful. So if you use that same general concept of defining that vision, it makes everything more understandable when people start to go down and start to develop the aspects of the product that you're developing or the task you're doing. And it's just not software development, but of course it's software development. But these are the big important parts. So Epic, let's talk about Epic. Epic, a big user story that needs to be broken down. Epics group together the bugs, the stories, and tasks to show the progress of a larger initiative. In agile development, epics usually represent a significant deliverable, such as a new feature or experience in the software your team develops. Here's a definition I think that you'll probably like. An epic is a larger story that cannot be delivered as defined within a single iteration or is large enough that it can be split into smaller user stories to be more effectively planned and so forth. There is no standard form to represent epic. Some teams use the familiar user story formats as a I want, so that, or in order to, as I want, while other teams represent epics in short phases. So the feature is how you implement your epic. Features are implemented within a single release. So you always try, one of the big values is you want to walk away with working software in some way, shape, and form. You want to define that so that working software is going to have that particular feature. And for instance, is the capability of being able to directly call out your database for user information automatically going to be parsed within the UI. I don't mean to be too complex about it, but a feature is something that the software does. And then, of course, story, user story, and how you implement your feature. Stories are implemented within an iteration. We're going to get into these a little more in depth, of course. So the vision, the product owner is responsible for knowing the product, its goals, and its requirements. And this is to be taking on throughout the project and takes the responsibility for creating the vision statement. Although other people may have input, the vision statement becomes the guiding light that we are trying to achieve. Okay, that is what we're trying to achieve statement that the development team, Scrum Master, and stakeholders refer to throughout the product. Anyone involved in the product, from the development team to the CEO, should be able to understand the product vision. Features. We kind of talked about that. Moreover, a chunk of functionality that delivers business value. Features can include additions or changes to existing functionality. For planning purposes, some agile methodologies also use the notion of work items, and you'll hear that throughout, that can include features, bug fixes, documents, and other artifacts. So the next item we're going to talk about is user stories or user stories? Well, anyone can write a user story. It's the product owner's responsibility to make sure that the backlog of an agile user stories exist, but that does not mean that the product owner is the one who writes them or overtly or although they are overtly ultimately responsible. Over the course of a good agile project, you should have to expect to have a user story examples written by each team member even before anyone starts writing them, so that they have an understanding of what the expectations of what the user story should be. Also, note that whoever writes a user story is far less important than who is involved in the discussion of it. Pretty deep stuff, but it kind of makes sense when you think about it. When are the user stories written? Many user stories are written throughout the Agile process, of course. Usually, a story writing workshop is held near the start of the Agile project. Everyone on the team participates in the goal of creating the product backlog that fully describes the functionality to be added over the course of the project, or in a 3 to 6 month release cycles there within. Some of these Agile user stories will undoubtedly be epics. Epics will later become decomposed into smaller stories that fit more readily into a single iteration. Additionally, new stories can be written and added to the product backlog at any time by anyone for any reason. So, writing a user story. Okay, here's a little more detail. A user story is that smallest unit of work in an Agile framework. It's an end goal, not a feature expressed from the software user perspective. To go a little more into the discussion about, do user stories replace a requirements document? It does not necessarily, but when the Agile Scrum and Sprint start to take consideration for how these things are being performed, it's always better to go forward with making sure that the user story is written even prior, and eventually user documentation can actually be its own sprint. That the user story is also composed is, as a user I want, is incomplete until the discussion about that story occurred, and we're going to go into that a little more. User stories, part of an Agile approach that shifts from writing about the requirements to talking about them. It includes a couple of written sentences, more importantly, a series of conversations about the desired functionality. So a user story, or just a story, is a simplified task within an epic. For instance, we may have such stories of sign up with email, sign up with Facebook, log in with email, log in with Facebook, forgot password, log out. If you've ever had interface with a computer, which of course everyone has, you see these more and more. These actually, when they started to develop that capability, that was a feature, they would write a user story to, actually registration and authentication. So these were all very critical for having it go. So the basis of the user story is defined as such. You're writing and kind of filling in the blank. User stories are most often written on index cards or sticky notes stored in like some sort of arrangements, a shoebox or whatever, arranged on walls and tables and facilitate in planning discussions. As such, they strongly shift the focus from writing about the features to discussing them. In fact, these discussions are more important than whatever text is written. So the user story itself is, as a user, as a blank, I want whatever that goal is, so that, boom, what is that reason that I want to achieve in that user story? And then here's an example. As a user, I can back up my entire hard drive. So how are we going to facilitate this? One of the benefits of Agile user stories is that they can be written in varying levels of detail. We can write a user story to cover the large amount of functionality. These large user stories are generally known as epics, of course, we just talked about. Because an epic is generally too large, we can write it down to this level. Here's some other ones. As a power user, I can specify files and folders to backup based on file size, data created, and date modified. As a user, I can indicate folders not to back up so that many backup drive isn't filled with things I don't need to be saved. So you can make this as simple and you can make it as complex as you need to have these. Now, a good person that writes user stories, it takes time. It takes the ability to be able to understand the actual definition of done, the vision, the epic, and it all boils down into that composition of the user story, and ultimately how are we going to perform the development tasks to meet that particular objective. How is detail added to user stories? By splitting the user stories into multiple smaller user stories. Some people would call them a subtask. By adding conditions of satisfaction. Details can be added to user stories. When a relatively large story is split into multiple user stories, it's natural to assume that detail has been added. After all, it has been written. As a vice president of marketing, I want to select a holiday season to be used when reviewing the past performance advertising campaigns so that I can identify profitable ones. So, I mean, you can make these into however you want to make it. And there was the one that I just mentioned here. So as a vice president, that's the person, I want to select a holiday season to be used when reviewing the past performance of advertising campaigns so that I can identify profitable ones. They all maintain those key elements. Definition of done. This is one of those critically important ones. Everyone needs to know it. Everyone has to have the same one. All sprints have to have the same definition of done. Provide a checklist which usefully guides pre-implementation activities, discussion, estimation, and design. So what I've done was maybe taken, I wish I could have taken a lot deeper dive relative to the composition and everything that we talked about relative to visions, epics, and user stories. So here is our question. The element that is the highest level attribute considered when formalizing development: 1, user story; 2, epic; 3, is it vision; or 4, feature? And of course, we know the highest level is the vision. Okay, thank you so much. Look forward to the next discussion.